On the evening of May 15th, 2008, a 13-year-old girl held a brand new digital camera in her hands. Her name was Aarushi Talwar, and she was 9 days away from her 14th birthday. The camera had been an early birthday gift from her father, something she had been asking for months. She was thrilled. That night, she took photograph after photograph, capturing moments of ordinary joy. Her room, her parents, her smile. The timestamp on the last photo she ever took read 10:10 at night. Less than 6 hours later, Aarushi would be dead, murdered in her own bedroom while her parents slept just down the hall. And within 24 hours, a second body would be discovered on the apartment rooftop. Hemraj Banjade, the family's domestic help from Nepal, also murdered, also with his throat cut. Same method, same night. But who killed them, and why? This is one of India's most controversial and heartbreaking unsolved cases. A case that exposed the failures of investigation, the cruelty of media sensationalism, and the deep prejudices that still run through society. But before this became a headline, before it became a controversy, before it became a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system, this was the story of two people, two human beings with lives, dreams, families, and futures. This is their story, the story of Aarushi and Hemraj, two victims who deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Aarushi Talwar was born in May of 1994 in Noida, a planned satellite city near India's capital, New Delhi. To understand Aarushi's world, you need to understand Noida itself. This was not the crowded, chaotic India of popular imagination. Noida was modern, clean, organized. Built as a special economic zone, it attracted multinational corporations, tech companies, and educated professionals. The skyline was dotted with high-rise apartment buildings surrounded by manicured parks, shopping malls, international schools, gated communities. This was the India of the rising middle class, and the Talwar family was part of that world. Aarushi's parents, Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar, were both dentists. They had met in dental college in the late 1980s, fallen in love, and married in 1989. For 5 years after their marriage, they tried to have children. When Aarushi finally arrived in 1994, she was more than just a daughter. She was a miracle, the answer to years of hoping and waiting. From the moment she was born, Aarushi was surrounded by love. Not just from her parents, but from her grandparents on both sides, her aunts and uncles, her cousins. She was the center of their universe. Those who knew Aarushi describe her in remarkably consistent ways. Bright, bubbly, full of life. She had one of those laughs that could light up a room. The kind that made everyone around her smile, too. In school, she excelled. She was a straight A student, always near the top of her class. But she was not the kind of child who only cared about grades. Aarushi was curious about everything. She asked questions constantly. She wanted to understand how things worked, why things happened the way they did. Her teachers remember her as engaged, enthusiastic, always raising her hand. But Aarushi was not all academics. She loved to dance. From a young age, she had shown a natural sense of rhythm and movement. Her parents enrolled her in dance classes, and she took to it immediately. She would practice for hours, perfecting her steps, learning new routines. She would record herself dancing on video, then watch the recordings over and over, analyzing her movements, figuring out how to improve. Then she would show the videos to her friends, and they would all laugh and dance together. It was pure, uncomplicated joy. Photography was another passion. Aarushi loved capturing moments. She would take pictures of everything: her friends, her family, the sky, flowers in the park, random objects that caught her eye. She would print out her favorite photos and create collages on her bedroom walls. Her room was a gallery of memories, a visual diary of her life. When she asked her father for a digital camera for her 14th birthday, it was not just a request for a gift. It was a request for a tool to pursue something she loved. At school, Aarushi had a close circle of friends. She was popular, but not in the superficial way that popularity sometimes manifests in teenage years. She was popular because she was kind, because she listened, because she made people feel comfortable. She had a best friend named Anmol, and they were inseparable. They would talk on the phone for hours. They would text each other constantly, sharing jokes, gossip, observations about their teachers and classmates. Just normal 13-year-old girl things. There was also a boy named Rohit, who was part of her friend group. They texted frequently. They joked around. It was innocent friendship, the kind that 13-year-olds have before romantic complications enter the picture. At home, Aarushi lived in a spacious apartment on the second floor of a building in Sector 25 of Noida. The apartment was comfortable, well-furnished, the kind of home that reflected her parents' success and their desire to provide the best for their daughter. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur both worked long hours at their dental clinic. They were dedicated professionals, respected in their field. Dr. Rajesh also taught part-time at a dental college. They worked hard, but they always made time for Aarushi. Dinners together, helping with homework, watching television as a family in the evenings. Because both parents worked such demanding schedules, the household always employed domestic help. This was normal for families of their economic status in India. There was usually a cook, sometimes a maid for cleaning, occasionally a driver. Domestic workers were an integral part of middle-class and upper-middle-class households across India. For Aarushi, growing up with domestic help in the home was simply part of life. She treated them with respect, the way her parents had taught her to. The layout of the Talwar apartment is important to understand, because it would become a crucial element in the investigation that followed. This was not a simple apartment with one entrance. The security arrangements were complex, with multiple doors and locks. To enter the main living area from outside, you had to pass through 3 separate doors. First, a heavy iron gate, then a middle security grill door, finally an inner wooden door that opened into the living room. Each door had its own lock. Some locked automatically when closed. Others required manual bolting from inside, but there was also an alternate entrance. Next to the main iron gate was a smaller side door that led directly to the domestic help's quarters. This was designed so that the live-in help could come and go without disturbing the family. The apartment had 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom where Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur slept, a smaller bedroom for Aarushi, and a third room designated for whichever domestic worker was currently living with them. The rooms were connected by a hallway. Arushi's room was directly across from her parents' room. The helper's room was further down the hall. In May of 2008, there were 4 people living in this apartment: Dr. Rajesh, Dr. Nupur, 13-year-old Aarushi, and their domestic help, Hemraj Banjade. To understand this story, we need to understand Hemraj too, because he was not just a background character in Arushi's life. He was a human being with his own story, his own struggles, his own family who loved him and depended on him. Hemraj Banjade was in his mid-40s. He was from Nepal, from a small village in the hills where opportunities were scarce and poverty was common. Like thousands of other Nepali men, Hemraj had left his home to find work in India. The border between Nepal and India is open, allowing free movement, and Indian cities offered wages that Nepali villages could not match. It was not an easy decision to leave. Hemraj had a wife and a young son back in Nepal. His son was just a boy, growing up without his father present for most of the year. But Hemraj sent money home every month. That money paid for food, for clothes, for his son's education. That money was the difference between survival and destitution for his family. Hemraj had been working for the Talwar family for about 8 months by May of 2008. He was not just a servant. He was more like a household manager. He cooked, he cleaned, he did maintenance work, he ran errands. He was responsible for the day-to-day functioning of the household. His salary was modest by middle-class standards, about 5,000 to 6,000 rupees per month, equivalent to roughly $60 or $70. But it was more than he could earn in Nepal, and every rupee mattered. By all accounts, Hemraj was good at his job. He was reliable, hard-working, respectful. Dr. Rajesh seemed satisfied with his work. Dr. Nupur treated him fairly. Aarushi felt comfortable around him. She called him uncle, a term of respect for elder males in Indian culture. When Aarushi needed something, Hemraj would help. When her parents were working late at the clinic, Hemraj made sure she had dinner. He was part of the household routine, part of the daily rhythm of life in the Talwar home. Hemraj was not bitter about his situation. He understood that he was doing what he had to do for his family. He knew his sacrifice had meaning. Every month when he sent money home, he was building a better future for his son. Maybe his son would get an education. Maybe his son would not have to leave home to find work in a foreign country. Maybe his son would have choices that Hemraj never had. That hope kept him going through the long days, the hard work, the loneliness of being far from the people he loved. On May 15, 2008, life in the Talwar household seemed perfectly normal. It was a Thursday. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur worked at their clinic during the day. Aarushi went to school. Hemraj took care of the household duties. In the evening, the family gathered at home. Aarushi was excited about her new camera. She had been playing with it all evening, taking photos, figuring out the settings, delighting in this new toy. Her parents smiled, watching her joy. This was what they worked for, to give their daughter opportunities, experiences, happiness. That night, the family watched television together for a while. Around 11 o'clock, they decided it was time for bed. School night for Aarushi, work in the morning for the parents. They said their good nights. Aarushi went to her room. Her parents went to theirs. Hemraj was in his room. The apartment settled into the quiet of a normal night. Nobody could have imagined what would happen in the hours that followed. Sometime between midnight and dawn, someone entered Aarushi's bedroom. Someone killed her. The medical examiner would later determine that she died from a wound to her throat and injuries to her head. It would have been quick. She may not have had time to scream, to call for help, to understand what was happening. She was covered with a sheet, left in her bed. Down the hall, her parents slept, unaware that their daughter had been murdered just meters away. Hemraj was also killed that night. His body would not be discovered until the next day, but the medical evidence suggested he died around the same time as Aarushi. He too had his throat cut. He too had head injuries. His body was found on the rooftop terrace of the apartment building, partially covered with a piece of cloth. 2 people, murdered in the same location, in the same time frame, in the same manner. But who did this, and why? The morning of May 16, 2008, started like any other morning in the Talwar household. Around 6 in the morning, Dr. Nupur woke up. She went to Aarushi's room to wake her daughter for school, but Aarushi's bedroom door was locked from the inside. Dr. Nupur knocked. No response. She knocked again, louder. Still no response. She called out to Hemraj, asking him to come help. Hemraj did not respond either. His room appeared empty. Dr. Nupur felt the first flutter of worry. Why was Aarushi not responding? Why was Hemraj not around? She went to wake her husband. Together, they returned to Aarushi's door. Dr. Rajesh knocked loudly. He called Aarushi's name. Nothing. The door was definitely locked from inside, which meant Aarushi should be in there. But why was she not answering? Growing more concerned, Dr. Rajesh went to get help from a neighbor. Together they managed to force open Aarushi's bedroom door. What they found inside would shatter their world forever. Aarushi was lying on her bed, covered with a sheet. When they pulled back the sheet, they saw blood. Aarushi was dead. Her throat had been cut. There was blood on the pillow, on the mattress, on the sheet. Dr. Nupur's scream could be heard throughout the building. A mother's anguish, raw and unbearable. Dr. Rajesh stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Their daughter, their only child, their miracle baby, gone. Murdered in her own bed while they slept nearby. How was this possible? How had they not heard anything? Who could have done this? Within minutes, neighbors had gathered. Someone called the police. The Noida police arrived at the apartment around 7 in the morning. The scene they encountered was chaotic. Neighbors milling about, Dr. Nupur in hysterics, Dr. Rajesh in shock, a dead 13-year-old girl in her bedroom, and Hemraj was missing. His room was empty. His belongings were still there, but he was gone. To the police, the answer seemed obvious. Hemraj had killed Aarushi and then fled. It made sense to them. Domestic help, lower class, Nepali migrant worker, a position of trust abused, a young girl murdered. The servant disappeared. Case closed, or so they thought. The initial investigation focused entirely on finding Hemraj. He was declared a suspect. His photo was circulated. Police began searching for him. But something else was happening that would prove to be one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of Indian criminal investigation. The crime scene was not properly secured. Police officers walked through the apartment without proper protective gear. Evidence was touched, moved, contaminated. Neighbors wandered in and out. The media arrived quickly, and television cameras captured footage of the interior of the apartment. Crucial hours were lost. Vital evidence was destroyed. The investigation was botched from the very first moments, and nobody checked the rooftop terrace. The apartment had access to a rooftop area, just 1 floor above. It was not used regularly, and the door leading to it was often locked. But on that morning, with all the chaos and confusion, nobody thought to check there. Not for hours. Not for the entire day. It was not until the next day, May 17th, that someone finally opened the door to the rooftop terrace. There, they found Hemraj. He had been dead for over 36 hours by then. His body had been lying on the rooftop the entire time police were searching for him as a fugitive. He had his throat cut, just like Aarushi. He had head injuries, just like Aarushi. He had been killed the same night, probably around the same time. Hemraj had not fled. Hemraj had not killed Aarushi. Hemraj was a victim too. The discovery of Hemraj's body changed everything. If Hemraj was dead, then who killed them both? The investigation, already compromised by the mishandling of the crime scene, now had to pivot completely. The police had spent 24 hours chasing the wrong theory. They had told the media that Hemraj was the killer. Now they had to admit they were wrong, and they had no other suspect. This is where the story becomes even more complicated and disturbing, because the investigators, having failed so completely in the initial hours and days, would make choices that would compound their failures and turn this tragedy into a circus. They would leak information to the media. They would make public statements about intimate details of the victims' lives. They would float theories based on prejudice and assumption, rather than evidence, and they would destroy reputations in the process. Within days of the discovery of Hemraj's body, rumors began to spread. Whispers at first, then louder accusations. The police, speaking to journalists off the record, suggested that there had been an inappropriate relationship between Aarushi and Hemraj. They claimed that Dr. Rajesh had discovered them together in a compromising position and had killed them both in a rage. This was called honor killing, a practice that tragically still occurs in some parts of India, where family members murder relatives who they believe have brought shame to the family. These allegations were never supported by evidence. There was no proof of any inappropriate relationship. Aarushi was 13 years old. She was a child. Hemraj was a middle-aged man who worked for her family. The idea that there was some romantic or sexual relationship between them was not based on facts. It was based on prejudice, on stereotypes, on the worst assumptions about domestic workers and the families they work for. But once these rumors were out there, they took on a life of their own. The media ran with the story. Headlines screamed about honor killing. Television debates dissected the alleged relationship. Arushi's character was assassinated. Her text messages with her male friend Rohit were obtained and publicized, with commentators suggesting they proved she was promiscuous. Her clothing choices were analyzed. Her behavior was questioned. A dead 13-year-old girl who could not defend herself was being portrayed as somehow responsible for her own murder. Hemraj too was judged harshly, but in a different way. Because he was a domestic worker, because he was Nepali, because he was from a lower social class, many people were quick to believe he was capable of wrongdoing. Even though he too was a victim, even though he too had been murdered, he was talked about with suspicion. His relationship with the family was scrutinized. Questions were raised about whether he had been inappropriate with Aarushi, with no evidence to support such claims. This is one of the most painful aspects of this case. 2 people were murdered. 2 innocent people. A 13-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her. A man working hard to support his family. And in death, they were not treated with dignity. They were not remembered with respect. Instead, their reputations were destroyed by speculation, rumor, and prejudice. For Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur Talwar, the nightmare was just beginning. Not only had they lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, but they were now being accused of killing her. The police focus shifted entirely to the parents. Investigators theorized that Dr. Rajesh had killed both Aarushi and Hemraj, and that Dr. Nupur had helped cover up the crimes. The theory was that Dr. Rajesh had discovered the alleged inappropriate relationship, flown into a rage, killed Hemraj first, then killed Aarushi to silence her, then staged the scene to make it look like an outside intruder had committed the murders. There were problems with this theory. Many problems. For one, there was no physical evidence directly linking the parents to the murders. No murder weapon was ever found. The door locks were examined extensively, and there were conflicting reports about whether the doors had been locked from inside or outside. Some experts said the evidence suggested the doors were locked from outside, which would mean someone inside the apartment was responsible. Other experts disagreed. The forensic evidence was a mess, partly because the crime scene had been so badly contaminated in the first hours. There was also the question of motive. If Dr. Rajesh had discovered an inappropriate relationship and killed in a fit of rage, why would he have killed both victims in such a calculated manner? Why would he have hidden Hemraj's body on the rooftop? Why would he and his wife have been able to sleep through the night after committing such violent acts, then wake up and pretend to discover the crime? The theory required believing that 2 educated, professional, respected members of the community had committed brutal murders and then convincingly acted shocked and grieved the next morning. But the investigation moved forward with the parents as the primary suspects. In 2008, Dr. Rajesh was arrested, then released on bail. The case dragged on for years. The media coverage was relentless. Every development was front-page news. Television channels ran special programs. The Talwar family became one of the most famous and controversial families in India, for the worst possible reason. In June of 2008, barely a month after the murders, the case was transferred from the Noida police to the Central Bureau of Investigation, India's premier investigative agency. The CBI was supposed to bring professionalism and competence to the investigation. They did try. They examined multiple theories. They investigated other possible suspects. One theory that the CBI explored involved 3 other domestic workers who had worked in the same apartment complex. Krishna Thadarai, Rajkumar Singh, and Vijay Mandal were all employed by neighbors of the Talwars. The theory was that these 3 men had been drinking alcohol on the terrace that night. Hemraj had joined them. An argument had broken out. The argument had turned violent. Hemraj was killed. Aarushi, either witnessing the violence or hearing the noise, had gone to investigate. She too was killed to silence her. This theory would have explained how both victims ended up dead, and it would have explained why Hemraj's body was on the rooftop. These three men were investigated extensively. They were questioned. Their alibis were checked, but ultimately there was not enough evidence to charge them. No physical evidence linked them to the crime scene. No witnesses could confirm they were there that night. The CBI could not prove they had done it, so the investigation came back to the parents. Years passed. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur tried to rebuild their lives while living under the cloud of suspicion. Their dental practice suffered. Patients stopped coming. Friends distanced themselves. The social isolation was crushing. They had lost their daughter, and now they were losing everything else too. They maintained their innocence throughout. They insisted they had not killed Aarushi or Hemraj. They had loved their daughter more than anything in the world. How could anyone believe they would harm her? In November of 2013, more than 5 years after the murders, a CBI court convicted Dr. Rajesh Talwar and Dr. Nupur Talwar of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison. The judge found that the circumstantial evidence pointed to the parents. The judge believed that they had killed Aarushi and Hemraj, then attempted to cover up the crimes. The judge did not believe their claims of innocence. The conviction sent shockwaves through India. Some people felt vindicated. They had believed all along that the parents were guilty. Others were horrified. They believed this was a miscarriage of justice, that two innocent people were being punished for a crime they did not commit. The debate was fierce, dividing families and friends. Everyone had an opinion about the Talwar case. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur appealed the conviction. They spent 4 years in prison while their appeal made its way through the legal system. 4 years of being separated from the outside world, of being treated as murderers, of living with the knowledge that most of society believed they had killed their own daughter. It is impossible to imagine that pain. In October of 2017, the Allahabad High Court overturned the conviction. The judges found that the circumstantial evidence was not strong enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There were too many unanswered questions, too many alternative possibilities. The prosecution had not proven its case. Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur were released from prison. They were legally innocent, but the damage had been done. Their lives had been destroyed. Their daughter was gone. Their reputations were ruined. Even after being acquitted, many people still believed they were guilty. The stigma would never fully go away. They could not return to their old lives. They could not practice dentistry as they had before. They lived quietly, trying to find some measure of peace in a world that had treated them with such cruelty. So who killed Aarushi and Hemraj? 16 years later, we still do not know. The case remains officially unsolved. No one has been held accountable for taking 2 lives. The truth has never been definitively established. All we have are theories, suspicions, and a mountain of compromised evidence. What we do know is that the investigation failed at almost every level. The crime scene was mishandled. Evidence was contaminated or lost. The initial assumption that Hemraj was the killer wasted precious time and resources. The focus on the parents may have prevented investigators from pursuing other leads. The media coverage turned the case into entertainment, with no regard for the dignity of the victims or the rights of the accused. The entire process was a case study in how not to investigate a crime. We also know that this case exposed deep prejudices in Indian society. The immediate suspicion of Hemraj because he was a domestic worker. The willingness to believe that a 13-year-old girl could have been involved in an inappropriate relationship. The assumption that parents from a certain social class could not be capable of violence. Or conversely, that they must be guilty because they seemed too controlled in their grief. Class, caste, gender, and nationality all played roles in how people interpreted the evidence and formed their opinions. And perhaps most importantly, we know that 2 people died who should not have died. A young girl who was just beginning to discover who she might become. A man working hard to provide for his family back home. They had hopes. They had people who loved them. They had lives that mattered. And those lives were taken violently, senselessly, without explanation or justice. Aarushi's grandparents, both maternal and paternal, lost their beloved granddaughter. They had watched her grow from a baby into a bright, joyful teenager. They had dreams for her future. All of that was stolen from them. They also watched their son and daughter-in-law be accused of the most heinous crime imaginable. They maintained their belief in their children's innocence, but the pain of the accusations, the trial, the imprisonment, was almost unbearable. Hemraj's family in Nepal lost their provider, their father and husband. His young son grew up without him. The money that Hemraj sent home every month stopped coming. His widow had to find other ways to survive. His son had to give up on some of the dreams that Hemraj's sacrifice had made possible. And they had to live with the knowledge that Hemraj died far from home, that his death was barely mourned in India, that he was often portrayed as a suspect rather than a victim. The media's role in this case cannot be overstated. From the very beginning, journalists treated this as a sensational story rather than a tragedy. They published unverified rumors. They invaded the privacy of the victims and their families. They held television debates where panelists with no direct knowledge of the case declared the parents guilty or innocent based on speculation. They showed photographs of the crime scene, of Aarushi's bedroom, of personal items. They obtained and published Aarushi's private text messages, dissecting them for hidden meanings. This media frenzy served no public interest. It did not help solve the case. It did not bring justice to the victims. What it did was sell newspapers and generate television ratings. It turned real human suffering into entertainment. It destroyed reputations. It influenced public opinion in ways that made a fair trial nearly impossible. This is what is called trial by media, and it is one of the most destructive forces in modern criminal justice. There are lessons here about the responsibility of journalists to report facts rather than speculation, to protect the privacy of victims and their families, to remember that the people they are writing about are human beings, not characters in a story. There are lessons about the damage that can be done when the pursuit of sensational headlines takes precedence over truth and dignity. There are also lessons about the investigation of violent crimes. The Aarushi and Hemraj case is now taught in forensic science courses as an example of how not to handle a crime scene. Students learn about the importance of securing the scene immediately, of preserving evidence, of following proper procedures, of not jumping to conclusions based on assumptions or stereotypes, of keeping an open mind about all possibilities until the evidence points clearly in one direction. The failure to check the rooftop for 24 hours is particularly instructive. It shows how assumptions can blind investigators to obvious steps. Everyone assumed Hemraj had fled, so no one thought to search the building thoroughly. That assumption cost the investigation dearly. By the time Hemraj's body was found, crucial time had been lost, and the crime scene had been further compromised. The prejudice against domestic workers also played a role in the investigation's failures. Because Hemraj was a domestic worker, because he was Nepali, because he was from a lower social class, he was immediately viewed with suspicion. His death was not treated with the same urgency as Aarushi's, at least not initially. Even after his body was found, some people continued to believe he must have done something wrong, must have provoked the violence somehow. This prejudice prevented investigators and the public from seeing him as what he truly was, a victim. A man who had been murdered while doing his job, while working to support his family. The allegations about an inappropriate relationship between Aarushi and Hemraj deserve particular attention, because they reveal something ugly about how society views children, domestic workers, and relationships across class lines. There was never any evidence for these allegations. They were based purely on speculation and prejudice, yet they were repeated endlessly in the media and in public discourse. They became part of the narrative of the case, even though they were baseless. This is victim blaming at its worst. A 13-year-old girl was murdered, and instead of focusing solely on finding her killer, investigators in the media chose to question her character, to suggest she had somehow contributed to her own death through inappropriate behavior. This is not justice. This is not investigation. This is cruelty. Hemraj too was victimized by these allegations. His reputation was damaged by suggestions that he had behaved inappropriately with a child in his care. These suggestions were never proven and were likely false, but the damage was done. Even in death, Hemraj was not afforded the respect and dignity he deserved as a victim of violence. The question of whether Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Nupur Talwar killed their daughter, and Hemraj, is one that divides opinion even today. Some people remain convinced of their guilt. They point to the circumstantial evidence. They note that the crime scene suggested inside knowledge of the apartment layout. They question how an outside intruder could have killed 2 people in the apartment without waking the parents. They believe the parents' grief seemed controlled, even rehearsed. Others are equally convinced of the parents' innocence. They point to the lack of direct physical evidence linking the parents to the murders. They note that the crime scene was so badly contaminated that drawing any firm conclusions is difficult. They argue that the prosecution's theory required believing that 2 loving parents suddenly became brutal killers for no clear reason. They believe the acquittal by the High Court was the correct decision. The truth is, we may never know with certainty what happened on the night of May 15, 2008. The evidence is compromised. The investigation was flawed. Key questions remain unanswered. How did the killer or killers enter the apartment? Why were two people killed? Why was Hemraj's body moved to the rooftop? Why did no one hear anything? These questions may never be answered. What we can say with certainty is that the justice system failed Aarushi and Hemraj. Whether the parents were guilty or innocent, whether the 3 domestic workers were involved or not, whether some unknown intruder committed these crimes, the fact remains that no one has been definitively held accountable. No one has been punished in a way that brings closure. The case remains open, unsolved, a wound that has never healed. For the families left behind, there is no closure. Aarushi's grandparents live with the pain of her loss and the torture of not knowing who took her from them. Hemraj's family in Nepal live with the loss of their provider and the knowledge that his death received far less attention and sympathy than Aarushi's, simply because of his social position. The Talwar parents, whether guilty or innocent, have lived through a nightmare of accusation, conviction, imprisonment, and acquittal, their lives forever marked by tragedy. 16 years have passed since that terrible night. Aarushi would be 30 years old now if she had lived. She might have become a doctor, as she dreamed. She might have gotten married, had children of her own. She might have traveled the world, camera in hand, capturing moments of beauty and meaning. She might have danced at weddings, laughed with friends, built a life full of purpose and joy. We will never know what she might have achieved, what contributions she might have made, what happiness she might have found. Hemraj would have been in his 60s by now. He might have been able to return to Nepal, reunited with his family, watching his son grow into a man. He might have enjoyed the fruits of his years of hard work and sacrifice. He might have held grandchildren, told them stories, lived out his years surrounded by the people he loved. We will never know what his life might have been if it had not been cut short. What we can do is remember them, not as headlines, not as controversies, not as symbols of failed justice or media excess, but as people. Aarushi Talwar was a 13-year-old girl who loved to dance and take photographs. She was bright and kind and full of dreams. Hemraj Banjade was a hard-working man who left his home to provide for his family. He was dedicated and responsible, and committed to giving his son a better life. They were human beings with value, with dignity, with people who loved them. They deserved to live. They deserved justice. They deserved to be remembered with respect. This case teaches us many things. It teaches us about the importance of professional, competent investigation, about the dangers of prejudice and assumption, about the responsibility of media to report facts rather than sensation, about the fragility of reputation and the permanence of accusation, about the complexity of justice and the limitations of legal systems, about the human cost of failure when violent crimes go unsolved. But perhaps most importantly, it teaches us to remember that behind every crime statistic, behind every headline, behind every debate about guilt and innocence, there are real people whose lives matter, people with families who love them, people with dreams and hopes, people who deserved better than they got from the systems that were supposed to protect them and seek justice for them. Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade were victims twice over. First, they were victims of whoever killed them on that May night in 2008. Second, they were victims of a system that failed to properly investigate their deaths, failed to preserve their dignity, failed to find their killer, failed to bring justice. They deserved better. They still deserve better. And the best way we can honor their memory is to learn from the failures that followed their deaths, to demand better from our investigators and our media, to never forget that every victim is a person whose life had meaning and value. The clues in this case may have faded. The trail may have gone cold. The truth may never be fully known. But Aarushi and Hemraj will not be forgotten. Their lives mattered. Their deaths were tragedies. And their story, painful as it is, reminds us why justice matters, why truth matters, why dignity matters. Even when the system fails, even when closure seems impossible, we must never stop believing that every person deserves these things. Because every person, regardless of their age, their class, their nationality, their circumstances, is worthy of respect in life and in death. This has been the story of Aarushi Talwar and Hemraj Banjade. 2 lives cut short, 2 families devastated, 1 case that exposed the failures of justice and the cruelty of prejudice. May their memory serve as a reminder of what we owe to victims, to truth, and to the pursuit of justice, even when the path is difficult and the answers remain elusive.